So, as Carrie said, we're exploring interest in starting a mass socialist political party in the United States. Mass would mean more than a sect, either small or large. Socialist would mean more than merely democratic or liberal. Political would mean going beyond social and economic actions, including, but not primarily or limited to, holding political office. And a party is more than a movement or an organization. This will be an unprecedented undertaking in many respects, and in some ways it would be the first real political party in the United States. The only precedents are the old pre-World War I Socialist Party of America, which we'll be discussing a little bit today, and before that, the Republican Party of the mid-19th century. We want to include as much of the present avowed left as possible, from liberals to anarchists. We find the existing left to consist of talented organizers and thinkers, but they need a new and different context to be effective. Now they are condemned to ineffectiveness or to more or less support the Democrats. We are looking ahead to a decades-long, painstaking and patient, but deliberate and serious process. The building of a mass socialist political party will fundamentally alter the political, but also the social landscape in the United States and internationally, globally. The aim is to take governing power in the United States. This does not preclude, and indeed aims at doing so, indirect political cooperation with similar parties taking power in other countries. Now in 2016 is a good time to begin this project because of the disarray of the existing parties as well as of society. There is a window of opportunity with a new generation to embark on a political task and possibility that has been avoided since the 1960s New Left and also avoided since the 1930s Old Left, both of which were conditioned and distorted by the gravitational attraction of the Democratic Party, as well as the dynamics of anti-communism in the Cold War. We are past this now and so can proceed to build socialist politics free of such pressures. The Sanders campaign this year is something of a distraction, at least, from this task because it is a desperate attempt to reform the Democrats, which will not happen, and even if it did, would not lead to socialism, at least the way we understand it, in any way. All existing left social, economic, civic, legal, and political activism of all kinds should be conducted under the political banner of the struggle for socialism. We need to make all these disparate struggles coherent for any of them to be effective. Such struggles should take place in and through a socialist party. In the immediate future, the goal is to reconfigure US politics in terms amenable to a socialist left. The Republicans should be the capitalist party. The Democrats should be the party of middle-class democracy. A socialist party should be for the working class in its struggle for socialism. Socialism will be the realization of the social potential made possible but held back by capitalism. We need a party to pursue the politics of this task. Join us. All right, so I'd like to introduce Bill Pelz, who is speaking today on Eugene Debs and the socialist tradition in American history and its meaning today. So Bill is the editor of this book, which is the Eugene V. Debs Reader, and also the author of the book, Karl Marx, A World to Win. So maybe without further ado, we could start our discussion today. So one question that I had straight away is what initially and when did this happen that you were motivated to delve into the study of socialist politics in American history?
Well, basically, I think I was most drawn to socialist history and all that sort of experience. I grew up in Englewood, which is a poor working class neighborhood on the south side. I understood all sorts of problems going on in society and so on. But then I went away to college to a place called Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And I all of a sudden found myself a minority, not an ethnic minority for sure. Mm-hmm. There were only like 101 African Americans on campus at the time. So I wasn't an ethnic minority, but I was a class minority. Mm-hmm. I had never really, I shouldn't say I'd never met these people before, mm-hmm. but I'd hardly ever interacted with them. And I just couldn't believe how incredibly elitist they all were, right? You know, when I said I was from Chicago, they'd say things like, isn't that where all the, they didn't use the word black, I'll use the word black people live, you know, et cetera, et cetera. mother of fraternities, so they had all these frat rats, some of them were openly racist, hanging statues of black stable boys from the frat house. I mean, you understand what I'm getting at. I came from Chicago, which is a pretty racist place. But I'd never actually seen this sort of stuff up close and personal, right? I mean, so it was just kind of shocking. That, and of course, the Vietnam War, which was going on, was a very radicalizing thing. So somehow I thought this wasn't quite right. And then I met various left sects, as you might call it, of various sorts. People thought Mao Zedong was, of course, going to be this great leader, and the Cultural Revolution had been a wonderful thing. The original people formed the RCP now. And of course, I met the Socialist Workers' Party, the main Trotskyist group, and they were talking about Trotsky and so on and so forth, all of which I found very intellectually stimulating to think about, but all of which seemed a little bit sort of alien. So I started looking around to see if there was any sort of indigenous left tradition. And that's where I hit upon the fact that there once upon a time, I mean, technically there was still a Socialist Party, but it was basically a wing of the Democratic Party, supported the war in Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. So I didn't consider them really part of the tradition. There had actually been people who had opposed all this stuff. And so I found that very, very interesting. And so, thus I got involved with looking at Debs, and also then, of course, looking at other people. I'm trained as a comparative labor historian with a minor field in comparative radical movements. So, I mean, this was sort of what I studied academically, but also came out of my own personal experience in terms of being very interested in that. Sorry for such a long-winded answer.
So, with respect to the history, what do you find to be the most sort of promising periods in terms of potential that we can look back to for resources, analogies to current dynamics in society and politics? What has grabbed you at that level in terms of precedents and historical resources to draw upon?
That in the early 20th century, the socialist movement was, first of all, very diverse, as you said in your manifesto, quite correctly, including a large group of people who had different philosophical views but agreed on the central point of socialism, however they may have understood it, but also the fact that they built up their own local institutions like newspapers, magazines, and then when they got involved in the political arena, would run people for things like aldermen, things that aren't sexy, but actually have an impact and you spread your ideas. So I think that was the other thing, is when you hear about left parties, they immediately want to run somebody for president, right? Which is all well and good, but I mean, it's completely unrealistic to start out running for president. Now, Chris, I'm not saying that you wouldn't make a good candidate, but I also have to say, I also have a master's in political science, you wouldn't have much of a chance, right? On the other hand, however, right, any one of us here in this room could perhaps get elected to the Water Reclamation Board or alderman, various things like that, because then you can focus your energy and focus the campaign and make it not just abstract ideas, but concrete what that means. So, for example, socialists in the early 20th century used to sometimes run on a slogan, lower your taxes, vote socialist, and tax the rich. And they would pass those flyers out in working class neighborhoods. They would even have, trucks and stuff, big thing. Lower your taxes, vote socialist, tax the rich. Right? Now, that may sound pretty crude and unsophisticated, but if you want to reach a mass audience, that's the sort of thing that would make people think for a second, because one of the big lies, of course, is that socialism means more government bureaucracy. It means that workers, white, black, or whatever their ethnic background, would just pay more taxes for a bunch of do-nothing bureaucrats. The whole sort of rap you hear from Republicans and Democrats, for that matter of fact. So, I mean, I think that's it, that they actually came up with some concrete ideas, and the idea of having an alternative media. I think that that's very important. So you actually had people who would read the socialist press consistently. For a while, during a printer strike in Chicago, there was the Chicago Daily Socialist, which many of you may have heard of. And for a brief period of time, the only way to figure out how the Cubs were losing this week was to buy the Chicago Daily Socialist, because the printers were on strike against all the other bourgeois papers.
Wow.
Right? And it's just fascinating to see them do something like that. And it's sort of amazing. You had, for example, in Chicago, William Rodriguez, whose father was a Mexican revolutionary, been involved in the Mexican Revolution, and his mother was a German socialist. He was an alderman in Chicago, and also head of the Chicago Federation of Labor. Now, there's problems, of course, with some of these compromises they make.
This is in the teens and 20s?
Yeah. This is, right. He's finally defeated after World War I when the party's destroyed, by massive repression. Because one of the things that destroyed the Socialist Party is this was the American Socialist Party, right? So they had all those illusions that Americans have. So one thing is, for example, they thought the First Amendment meant they could say they opposed the war. Pretty silly thinking, because they had all these lawyers, standing behind Debs who went to jail, standing behind all these people who later go to jail saying, don't worry about a thing. I've got a doctorate in law from Columbia, and this is against your constitutional rights. You're advocating your political position. You're a member of a political party. You guys hold, hundreds of offices across the country. They can't just throw you in jail for opposing the war. Well, guess what? They did.
Yeah.
But the big thing that destroyed it was not people like Debs going to jail. Big thing that destroyed them was when they denied them access to the postal service. It may sound strange, but you had places like Chicago where they had literally their own printing presses, and then they would ship them out, like where I teach currently. Unfortunately, sometimes. Elgin, the Elgin Socialist Party was able to maintain it longer than some because they could bring up the propaganda, the literature, on the train from Chicago. But more distant places relied on the post office to deliver it. In other words, it just was not practical to have people travel all the way to Butte, Montana, right, with a suitcase full of socialist literature. Before that, they just shipped it in the postal system, but they burned it under the Espionage Act as anti-American, anti-war, and so on and so forth.
Wow.
And the Socialist Party never recovered. And it was also selective repression, too. We should keep in mind it was the left-wingers went out in the streets and said, we're against the war, that get arrested and do jail time. The more get along, I want to reform this or that, and the legislator who stayed quiet, they tended to survive. Even though even Victor Berger, a very right-wing socialist, former mayor of Milwaukee, was elected to Congress, and they refused to seat him.
So let's dig into that a little bit further. What did the Socialist Party of America look like in the preceding period, like leading up to that, the crisis of World War I? What did it look like in terms of its membership? You mentioned newspapers. What kind of, how many papers did they have going in what cities? Like, what did it look like? You mentioned hundreds of officials elected. What did that party look like back then?
Well, had many different aspects to it. One was they won over farmers and native-born European Americans who had originally been at least spiritually involved with, say, the populist movement or one of those movements. So they won over that group, but they also had tremendous groups with the support among immigrants. So they had different foreign language sections. So, for example, they had a Finnish language publication for a long period of time among Finnish miners and so on. And I point that out because that was a relatively small European immigrant group. But they were very strong among German Americans, German immigrants. They were very strong among various Yiddish-speaking Jewish people from Eastern Europe. That was another one of their strengths. So it was a very diverse party, which was both its strengths, but at the same time, objectively, it's one of their weaknesses. Because they didn't necessarily all sort of pull in the same direction. So, for example, when the Russian Revolution happened, the people from Russia were emotionally predisposed to support it, no matter what. And other people who really didn't know much about Europe or care much about Europe kind of thought it was a distraction from the task of doing things in the here and now in America. So right away, before there was any controversy about the Bolsheviks or anything else, just even the February Revolution, there was sort of a conflict about how important this is.
So in terms of the resources of that kind of party and its activities, what was its kind of spread and penetration? Like, was it confined to certain areas? Was it strong in certain areas of the country? What did it look like at that level?
It was very strong in most cities. Obviously, it was an urban movement largely, but surprisingly, it also had support in rural areas where you had those radical farmers. Ironically, the state where the Socialist Party of America received the largest percentage of vote was Oklahoma.
Wow.
Which is comes as a big surprise. But then again, those people were really dispossessed and so on.
And so those were poor farmers.
Poor farmers.
So you mentioned the roots in the populist movement. And we could, maybe talk about Debs with respect to the labor movement. But in terms of the history feeding out of the populist movement, there is a lot of late 19th century radicalism coming out of, sort of post-Reconstruction. What are some lineages there for the early socialists in the United States?
Well, basically you had people, one thinks of Albert Parsons, who had been involved in things, came up here, the Haymarket affair, and he wound up being hung for his troubles and so on. So there were people who came out of radical Reconstruction. And with the destruction of radical Reconstruction, and for all intents and purposes, the destruction of not just the radical Republicans, but the Republicans as a whole in the South, those people were left homeless. And many of those people then saw the same sort of things they were talking about going on potentially in the Socialist Party. And the trouble is, because of extra-legal violence, in the Socialist Party, if they had integrated meetings of any sort in the South, they would either be broken up because of laws by the police or just broken up by the Klan. So increasingly, that was a problem anywhere where the rural areas didn't have the strength to sort of survive that sort of repression.
The physical,
I stress that because most people are fed this fairy tale that America, unlike other countries, hasn't had a lot of political repression. That's simply not true. That's simply not true. There was a tremendous amount of repression, which meant that the smaller, more isolated areas were tremendously broken up. Like, for example, you imagine sharecroppers, right? You try to organize a union of sharecroppers, there'd be black sharecroppers, white sharecroppers, they'd meet in some church, and it'd be attacked by the Klan, right? I mean, shot at and stuff, I don't mean demonstrations.
But actually physically repressed. So let's get into Debs a little bit and his history. So maybe you could describe who he was, where he came from, and how he ended up being a socialist.
Well, he's from Terre Haute, Indiana, which is sort of interesting because it's not the sort of place one would expect a radical to come from. He'd originally been in the Democratic Party. He didn't be a state legislature for the Democrats, but he was a railroad worker. And he realized that the whole craft divisions in the railroads made it really impossible to get things really organized. He really needed more power than that. So he organized a railroad workers union that went beyond, it was an industrial union, went beyond the craft divisions. And of course, then when he had the big Pullman strike in sympathy with the Pullman strikers, they stopped that. The government consciously broke the strike by attaching mail cars to trains. So therefore, if you tried to stop that train,
it was a federal offense.
Federal offense. And he wound up in jail in Woodstock, Illinois here for, violating that. Now, when he was in jail in Woodstock, that's when he first read Marx and started to get more theoretical. Rather than just being a knee-jerk sort of trade union prairie radical, he started to actually get more theoretical because he had a lot of time on his hands.
So just a point of clarification for those who don't understand this. So the difference between craft unionism and industrial unionism.
So craft union meant that the people who drove the train were in one union, the people who ran the switches for the train were in another union, the people who collected tickets if it was a passenger train were in a different union, people in the caboose, dealing with those things would be in a different union. So you'd be separated in all these different craft unions. By the way, that's the situation today. And to deal with this problem, they've essentially passed a law, which in all intents and purposes outlaws strikes on the railroads, which has now been applied, of course, to the airlines as well. They have these cooling off periods they can mandate and this, that, and the other thing.
Where the industrial union would be everybody
in the same, who works for the same companies in the same union, regardless of skill level. That's why they call them craft unions. There's a different skill. You see that in universities. Often when they organize, you're going to have one union for the full-time professors, another union for adjuncts, another union for the staff, another union for the maintenance people, et cetera, et cetera. Well, he would, of course, be advocating. He was the founder of the Industrial Workers of the World, which was a radical attempt to set up industrial unions. He would advocate that, well, everybody works at the same university should be in the same union. Not really that hard an idea to imagine, really.
So he came to that perspective more sort of objectively as a labor organizer. And then the exposure to Marxism when he had time to read in jail, what did that look like, and where did he go with it?
Well, he started to realize that this wasn't just quirks in the systems or flaws in the system, that it was actually systemic. It actually was the whole nature of the capitalist system that caused it to act that way. If this wasn't bad people versus good people, this was the inherent objective nature of the system. He read Das Kapital. I mean, not saying he understood it all, of course. I mean, he wasn't a...
Who does?
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't claim. Volume 3 completely confuses me. But anyhow, the point is he gave him the idea that it was systemic, because the problem he had before, which I would say in general is the problem among Americans, is they always think it's like bad people or flaws in the system, rather than this is the way the system actually works. This is the way it's supposed to work.
So in terms of becoming a socialist, what did his politicization look like? What kind of organizations existed? Because this was before there was a Socialist Party of America, was it not?
There were other little sects, going back to the Working Men's Party. But yeah, there was a Socialist Labor Party, which was became led by a Columbia professor named Daniel de Leon, who had some very interesting ideas of things. A lot of ways sort of came up with the idea of Soviets before they developed in Russia and all of that. But he essentially, when the American Railroad Workers Union was crushed, he decided that, well, any union movement in and of itself is going to be prey to the state repression, so we need a political party. So they formed a political party, the Socialist Party of America, ultimately came out of the Railroad Workers Union and then fusing with various little
other groups. So you mentioned running for president. So this is something that Debs is known for. Historically, he's known as something of a quixotic figure in terms of being a standard bearer for American socialism at that level of national campaigns. So what did that look like? What's the history of that? I know that he ran a few times.
Yeah, he ran, I think, 5 times. But his biggest vote totals were 1912 and 1920. In 1912, for example, he was able to get 6% of the vote, which may not sound like a lot, but in the context of the time was quite a bit. And even in 1920, they ran him from prison, which was a very interesting sort of thing to do. Right, so they had buttons. Many of you may have seen the photos of them. It said "Vote for Convict," and it'd have his number on it, and so on and so forth. He was sort of like the mouth of the socialist movement in a lot of ways. And what people miss is when I say 6% of the vote for president, is that at local areas he would get much larger votes, and the Socialist Party candidates always ran ahead of him. In urban areas, they got more votes because there's a certain number of voters who, in their heart of hearts, wanted Debs but knew he didn't have a chance, and therefore maybe they'd vote for Wilson because maybe he'll keep us out of war or whatever. Yeah, that didn't work real well, did it? But so the local
they'd vote for local candidates because they actually had more of a chance of being elected.
Right. In other words, they'd come for Debs to the rallies, right? But they would stay to vote socialist in the local race. So one time the Socialist Party had 2 members of the House of Representatives, for example.
Where from?
New York and Milwaukee.
From New York City.
New York City.
So you mentioned Victor Berger. I know that there's some, that's another kind of major aspect of this history, what people refer to as like sewer socialism or like local reform socialism, and that Milwaukee is usually the example that people raise of that. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that history and also what that looked like, that there was actually a mayor, someone in a senior executive position of a municipality. What was that like?
And the entire city council too, right?
Sorry?
And the entire city council.
At one point.
The entire city council?
Well, majority.
Effective.
Yeah. Well, the problem they had, of course, building socialism in one brewery or whatever you might say. sort of a problem.
Sounds like a good idea.
Completely bad given our context, right? It seems pretty apropos, actually. But Yeah, they concentrated on a lot of reforms that were very necessary. Like building sewers may not sound like a big deal, but you had tremendous levels of disease.
Certainly
in
back
cities
then.
Back then, because you didn't have sewers. It was this privatization thing we're seeing, where if you want sewers, get rich, and then you can go to a neighborhood and pay for sewers, right? That was the sort of attitude. So they did a lot of sort of useful things. The problem was they got caught up so much in being a machine and running the local city that they sort of lost the larger vision. That in a lot of ways, I think. So they would give in to local prejudices and this, that, obviously racism being the most obvious, because they wanted to get reelected. But they did have a long run. The last socialist mayor of Milwaukee served 3 terms from 1948 to 1960. And what's amazing about that is he was able to survive the McCarthy period.
Right, the 50s.
But he didn't have a majority in the city council anymore.
That was right there.
And that's a real problem he had, Frank Zeidler.
So what did it look like in terms of getting along with the local capitalists and whatnot? What did administering, governing, if not ruling, if you will?
They were in office, but they weren't in power.
Right. What does that look like?
Well, it meant that you had to make a series of compromises all the time. That was the sort of problems. Because there's no way you could get away with the more radical notions that some people wanted, like expropriating their businesses. So you had to be intent on imposing labor standards, making them, hire union labor, raise their taxes, reassess their buildings. It may sound like a little thing, but American socialism earlier on, Joseph Wiedemeyer, a friend of Karl Marx, had been basically the military dictator of St. Louis County during the Civil War, and afterwards he had a plan to take over the Republican Party. His math was, white workers per free slaves give us a majority, and so he got himself elected as county assessor and raised the property evaluations on all the capitalist business. Because one of the typical ways the capitalists cheat on their local taxes is by undervaluing their property. So there are a lot of things like that they could get away with, and they could do that in terms of fair tax assessments and so on. But there was always that sort of problem.
Business property.
Yeah,
business property.
Yes, business property, and then lower the taxes on homeowners. Right. That's how they build a base. That's how they would build a base. That, like during the Great Depression, the Socialist Party in Milwaukee kept its base by having their own welfare programs. Before the New Deal. Making sure that food was distributed and so on and so forth. But you always have to, that's the trouble with being in office but not being in power. You're always going to have to be making compromises of various sorts. And that becomes a very tricky problem about where you can and shouldn't make a compromise and where you can and should.
What was the national and international vision of the early Socialist Party of America in this kind of pre-World War I at its height? What was the perspective on political change in the United States, and how did they envision pursuing socialism as a political goal?
Well, they basically thought internationally that they saw socialist parties in Germany and Italy, in France, getting stronger and stronger. They thought that eventually the socialist parties would be strong enough that the Social International would not just be a meeting of like-minded people, but it would actually become like perhaps even a world government or something. They had a lot of illusions about the franchise, that as long as people could vote, and if we can expand the franchise to women, then women will vote and they'll get more involved and so on and so forth. So they really got a little bit sort of enslaved to the electoral road, that just run in elections, and that was sort of a problem, because they really had a certain naivete that we wouldn't have today, because from their point of view, most of these people started out either personally or historically looking back and just saw a march of progress in terms of socialism around the industrialized countries around the world and within the United States, right? Which had been, what had started out as a small bunch of German immigrants or Jewish immigrants meeting in some, delicatessen or beer hall, talking about things and so on, became this sort of mass movement. They actually elected people. They were really really had sort of illusions. And in Chicago, for example, they started to come to grips with those illusions, ironically, during the war. Because in 1917, the Socialist Party, according to many historians, we'll never know for sure, actually won the municipal elections.
Here in Chicago.
Here in Chicago.
Uh-huh.
But there was, it may sound just unbelievable, but they stole the election from them.
Uh-huh.
I mean, how could they do that in the city of Chicago?
In Chicago, of all places.
So known for its honesty. And that was the problem. That was part of the problem. If you count on that, you assume certain things, like you assume a fair election.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the 1912 election as a kind of a high watermark. It just strikes me, knowing some other history that I know, that that's also the high point for the German Socialist Party.
Right.
1912, so right before World War I. So it's a kind of an interesting kind of moment, like the pre-World War I sort of high point of international socialism. But apart from elections, what else did they do? Like what kind of activity did the Socialist Party engage in?
They engaged in a lot of cultural activity.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, there was a place in downtown Chicago, it was torn down years and years ago, called Sanger Hall.
Mm-hmm.
And, for example, they'd organized what was sometimes called, somewhat satirically, somewhat honestly, Socialist Sunday School.
Mm-hmm.
This might sound sort of strange, but in many neighborhoods, it was just considered that you see all your neighbors going off to church. The point is, because it's the United States, it would be different denominations. So if somebody got up on Sunday and went off to church and didn't come to your church, you didn't necessarily think that was so strange. You'd say, oh, they're Catholic or they're Protestant or whatever it might be. And what they do is they'd have all these meetings, and they would meet on Sundays. And
so they wouldn't be noticed. People would assume they're going to some other church.
Right, but it also became a routine because people would have been raised going to church on Sunday mornings.
So it was
and now
a good time.
It was tradition, right?
Mm-hmm.
The day they had off. So now they'd get up and they'd go to the Socialist Party meetings. And they'd have a lot of cultural activities, a tremendous amount of cultural activities. Singing groups, for example. They would have all sorts of, how would you put it, Socialist Boy Scouts. They were deathly opposed to the Boy Scouts, or at least the left wing, because the Boy Scouts were a militaristic, to train people to be soldiers, right? So the problem is the Boy Scouts had a lot of appeal. They took city kids, and you got to go off to some park somewhere and go camping and start fires and all the fun stuff. So they'd have their own thing without the being brave, true, reverend type stuff. Rather, I'm pledged to the working class and So, and those alternative activities are important too, because they would often draw far more people than were actually party members.
So they had a broader appeal, broader milieu.
Like when they had summer camps, you'd have non-party members send their kid to the summer camps just as a type of babysitting. And because they weren't unsympathetic to the socialists, right? And they'd have crafts and games. And in the summer, you'd have socialist teachers who volunteered their time, got paid a very nominal amount. You paid a very nominal amount to have the kids go to that. But it would be, you'd be taught things like science, right? Geography, so you taught not just socialism.
Like a liberal education.
A liberal education.
So you mentioned that when Debs was involved in forming the Socialist Party, that a large component of it came out of the railway union. What did the relationship between organized labor and the Socialist Party look like?
It was problematic because the Socialist Party tried to essentially, understandably enough and quite correctly in my opinion, take over the American Federation of Labor and get rid of this Gomper's business union, pure and simple trade unionism, and so on. So Gompers, who had been at least vaguely sympathetic in his own way at the beginning, became more and more hostile to the socialists because they were after his job, essentially. In fact, they did elect somebody different for one term. But so there was this constant sort of fight between the socialists in the union and the sort of pure and simple trade unionists in the union. Now, if that's in the AFL, in any given union, there was, of course, fights. The Brewers Union was socialist. Clothing workers were socialist, so on and so forth. Then other unions would not be socialist. They would not be able to win those unions over. So they caused a split, not official split, but a split. And that's why Debs it participates in the founding of the Industrial Workers of the World in 1905 is because he believes as long as the unions are divided up into these craft unions, as we discussed before, that you wouldn't really have the power you needed. You wouldn't have that inspiration, but you also wouldn't have the social power of a united group of workers. So this was also a big problem. Even before the foundation of the Industrial Workers of the World, is that the socialists, Debs, at least the left-wing socialists, were for industrial unionism. Now craft unionists sort of looked down upon or saw as a threat the unskilled workers. You know, that divide and conquer was largely successful among many of them. So, I mean, it was a real problem. Not just, forget about socialism, okay, you want socialism, that's a nice thing to talk about. If it gets us better labor legislation, we're all for it. But when you start talking about industrial unionism, that directly threatens
the privileges that some
privileges they have. So, like for example, I'm a member of the American Federation of Teachers, right? Which is run sort of like a big benevolent version of Stalin's Russia. I mean, they don't.
Benevolent version.
Yeah, benevolent. I mean, when you go to speak against the bureaucracy, they don't kill you or even beat you up. They just turn off the mic. And so I've been to some of these conventions. It's sort of a dismal affair. But like, for example, and you have this separate teachers union, the National Education Association.
Right.
And the National Education Association's whole claim to fame is that we're not in the same AFL-CIO with like steel workers and so on. I mean, that's one of their big things, partly against going with the AFT. And of course, the AFT doesn't want to go with the National Education Association because it, threatens the bureaucrats' privilege. And it's absolutely ridiculous to have two unions for teachers, right? There's no real difference between them, except the AFT historically is again urban areas, and the NEA is like Oakton.
Suburban.
Yeah, suburban. But again, that's the another problem with the unions you have.
But the way the Socialist Party of America then really operated with respect to the labor movement was through the AFL, and then later through the IWW effort.
They tried both. They tried both, and they also. The thing is, they were trying to turn the AFL into something else, and they failed.
What was the model for that they were looking at? Were they looking at things like trade union Congress in the United Kingdom? Like what was the vision there?
The vision was basically they looked at examples in Europe where people united, but it was also just a very practical thing because, the capitalists may be many things, but when it comes to money, they're not foolish. So, you'd have maybe 6 unions in a place, where today you wouldn't have any, but you'd have maybe 6 unions in a place, and the contracts would all be set to expire at a different time.
At different times, yeah.
That'd be the sort of things they do. So they realized, well, wait, if we all got together, somehow.
So it's pragmatic.
It was pragmatic in many senses.
Did they rely on like that organized labor base, or did they rely more on a just sort of general working class base, the Socialist Party?
It was more of a general working class base most places. But of course, where they had a trade union base, that would be very important, particularly in terms, of course, getting resources. Right. So, for example, you won't hear the Unite building on 333 South Halstead, not far from here. You won't hear them bragging about it. They usually, if you want to rent a room, they want to rent you the Abraham Lincoln room. But to this day, they have a Debs room.
Oh, do they?
Yes, they do. They have a Debs room because they used to be part of the Socialist Party, right? And that's why in the old days, when they were a socialist union, when there was a clothing workers union with its name and so on, for example, they went around the capitalists. They had their own healthcare clinic. They hired doctors and nurses and equipped an entire top floor for medical treatment of their workers.
At the Union Hall?
At the Union Hall.
That's
and
great.
Near the Union Hall, you can also find, some of them still exist, they've had to turn them over to some other trust because unions, Taft-Hartley and all that. They built their own workers' housing.
Oh, did they?
Yeah.
Wow.
See, that was the sort of thing. And they had cooperatives in many places. So, for example, Minnesota and Wisconsin were real big on these cooperatives, where the Socialist Party would get involved in the cooperative movement. And, they'd say, read the socialist press, vote for the socialist ticket, and shop at the socialist cooperative. They're trying to create, sort of like the SPD did in Germany, create an alternative universe, an alternative world.
For the working class.
For the working class.
No, because one does hear about co-ops, so maybe you could talk about that a little bit, because that's, again, deep history. So you're talking about housing co-ops and consumer co-ops.
Right.
So what does that look like?
Well, the idea was that you could, among the rural population, you form co-ops so they could band together and get fairer, higher prices for their produce. So that's pretty basic. In fact, you still have that sort of cooperative.
Yeah, it still goes on.
In like the milk industry and so on in Wisconsin, I believe, and so forth. But the consumer co-ops are all but gone, and that was the idea of cutting off the capitalist minimum. It was a really basic sort of idea that, well, the capitalists aren't there to help you. They're not there to facilitate, from producer to consumer. They're there to make a profit. So if you cut them out and just have administrative costs and pay people a fair wage, you can undercut the capitalists. But this became very hard because, needless to say, the capitalists go after these institutions, like refuse to sell them things, right? Refuse to service them, and so on. And as the capitalists get bigger and bigger in any industry, it's harder for any co-op to actually compete. With them.
So, all right, maybe backing up a little bit, and getting back to the sort of Socialist Party of America per se, and Debs as a figure, and the kind of changes that went on in the early 20th century with respect to the international socialist movement, leading up to World War I. You mentioned that there's repression, there's a kind of crisis, but what did that look like as a political phenomenon within the Socialist Party? Like, why was it not able to survive?
I think it wasn't able to survive because they had no strategy for any sort of repression or illegality. They were counting on the U.S. Constitution being as written in terms of freedom of speech and everything else. And they really couldn't conceive of these things happening to them. So that meant that some people, the more right-wing or pragmatic, ultimately defect to the Democrats during the New Deal. By the New Deal, they start to defect to the Democrats, like the Clothing Workers Union when they endorsed Roosevelt. I mean, that's a big sign of things, because before they'd stayed strictly independent of any of the sort of bourgeois parties. They didn't really have any strategy. They didn't know how to deal with this sort of thing, and they were robbed of their most talented members for a number of years because they were in prison. So that was sort of a problem. Then, of course, they had a split in the Socialist Party over the Bolshevik Revolution, where the majority of the Foreign Language Federation members, and perhaps a majority of the party itself, there may have been some hanky-panky at the convention to vote against this sort of thing, broke off and formed two, or if you include the Proletarian Party, three communist parties. And for the longest time, Zinoviev and the Comintern kept writing these angry letters saying, you guys can't have three parties, you got to have one party. And finally, two of them, the Communist Labor Party and the Communist Party of the United States, maybe, I forget the exact title, they formed the Communist Party. And the Proletarian Party just continued as a sort of relic like the Socialist Labor Party until I think their last members have died sometimes in the 70s or something like that. But they continued. And that was mainly, I believe, in Michigan and Ohio was where that had been the Proletarian Party. So they lost all those people, right? They were disrupted, They didn't have a strategy how to cope with that. Because you got to remember, they were always kind of based on this idea of things sort of getting better and better. And yeah, okay, kind of a setback.
But World War I's a major crisis.
Yeah, absolutely, major crisis.
So there are two, you mentioned the split around the Bolshevik Revolution and around communism and the proliferation of these new parties. There are two famous quotations from Debs with respect to the Bolshevik Revolution and communism coming out of the Bolshevik Revolution. One is that to the marrow of my bones, I'm a Bolshevik, and the other was, I'll never take orders from a maniac like Zinoviev.
Those are probably both very appropriate.
I think so, yeah. And so
Zinoviev was a maniac.
Let's talk about that a little bit. In other words, how through the figure of someone like Debs, we look at how the tradition of the Socialist Party of America weathered that crisis again through a figure like Debs, who was sympathetic but also had differences, and how we might understand that history from towards the end of Debs's life, the early 1920s. In terms of what do we take from that? Because I think an established kind of left narrative is something like, well, Debs belonged to an older tradition, and he didn't get on board with the new impulse towards the Third International, towards communism, and that he's, in a sense, easily sort of relegated to the past that way. But how do you make sense of that ambivalence that he had around the changes?
I think on the one hand, he supported any sort of revolution against capitalism, but didn't mean he supported it uncritically.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, he believed tremendously in left unity.
Mm-hmm.
And what really bothered him was this sort of splitting, like the 21 conditions and all this other stuff. Because he really thought that the left should be united and have different wings to it, right? And he didn't believe that if you should split it all. He really was against this sort of idea of splitting. And unfortunately, he also believed that not only shouldn't split, but he sort of had like an industrial union version of what he thought the left should be. And what happened is, and here's the problem, is they let in so many non-working class members that when he dies, the next major leader of the Socialist Party will be Norman Thomas, who was a Methodist minister who famously employed African-American staff very cheaply at his house and so on and so forth. But they always said, oh, he was the moral voice and so on. But you can see, if you look at the demographics, that it shifts from being a very working class organization, very eclectic, but very working class organization, to being this sort of like a conscience of the Democratic Party or something like that.
So more of a kind of middle class or intellectual,
right,
favoring that. And
it finally winds up endorsing Norman Thomas, endorsing Lyndon Johnson in 1964, So that's sort of how that sort of ends up. It ends up badly. Let's put it that way.
So
because
let's talk a little
trying to have
bit.
that unity. That's the thing. It's very elusive for him.
That issue of unity, how you understand that. In other words, you said that Debs's vision of left unity is really a kind of a class unity.
Class unity, and a second international idea that the party should represent all progressive elements of society, but be based on the working class.
But did he think, therefore, that the Socialist Party as a whole should be supportive of the Bolshevik Revolution, for instance?
He said in several speeches that they should be.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
So he gave them unconditional but not uncritical support, because just like he would support anyone running as a socialist, didn't mean he wouldn't have criticism of them. He said that once, right? He said, well, I support the Bolsheviks, I support them, but doesn't mean I'm not critical of them.
It's like a Rosa Luxemburg perspective.
Yeah, very much like Luxemburg.
Question?
Yeah, so I just we talked about the influence of Bolshevism on Debs himself, but could you also maybe talk about the role that Bolsheviks or Russian revolutionaries had on the Socialist Party? I know there was a lot of Russian exiles that were working or communicating with the American Socialist Party right before they go back to Russia in 1917.
Right. Well, people who had been in the United States and then went to Russia would have and then sometimes come back would have a tremendous influence because they came back and actually, what was the famous saying from John Reed? I've seen the future and it works.
Yes.
Right. So Reed, who originally hadn't been in the party exactly, he goes over, comes back, writes 10 Days That Shook the World, and forms one of those communist groups, Communist Labor Party, I believe, and so they had a tremendous influence because here supposedly was the example of all these things they talked about for so long, and it actually being successful, right? So they had an organic connection too, because sometimes certain members of the family would go back and participate in the Russian Revolution, but other members would stay here.
But you also had Russians like Trotsky, and I think even maybe Zinoviev came over to the U.S. prior to staying there in exile, and they did sort of interact with the Socialist Party and were sort of somewhat active with the left wing of the party.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
What sort of impact that had on the party as a whole?
Well, it tended to polarize the party because you had, among certain foreign language federations, people who became then completely for whatever the Bolsheviks wanted, and this, of course, offended groups who weren't so enamored with the Russian model or just were distant from it, right? So it sort of took the existing problems and made them more.
Another question.
Yeah, one narrative that I usually come across when people talk about the history of the socialist movement, not just the party in the United States, is that kind of the fact that a lot of foreign workers were in the party actually was the major problem for the growth of the Socialist Party. In other words, there's no kind of like, homegrown base of American workers. You, however, mentioned earlier, no, there's like an American Socialist Party base.
The Appeal to Reason was published in Kansas and sold like 1 million copies.
So you flat out reject that narrative?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly were. I mean, not just Debs. I mean, all sorts of people, who were indigenous radicals, and also that statistic about them winning the most votes ever in the state of Oklahoma. You can say a lot of things about Oklahoma, but you can't claim that there are a lot of foreign workers there. Probably much more foreign workers there now than there were at the time.
Right.
So they actually had appeal to indigenous, workers, going to call them that. And in fact, that was the sort of thing that was used by anti-socialist forces to split the party.
To split them.
Yeah, the Chicago Tribune, which used to run an editorial campaign on their front page, was constantly like foreign baiting them, right? And they had a stock figure which they continued, I believe, into the 60s even, certainly into the 50s. I'll have to go back and look over the stuff that they have in their archives. And it was a figure of this little guy, all dressed in black with a round black bomb, and and he'd have some caption like, "Was ist da? Democracy," and they'd show him being dragged off by a tall policeman. But that was just one character. I mean, he was a stock character, and they're trying to say that with these people, I know you're
Germans
upset.
are dangerous.
Yeah, Germans are dangerous. Foreigners are dangerous. These people aren't like us.
They're radicals.
Right?
This narrative comes out of like the right wing of the Socialist Party itself too, right? Because
absolutely.
Attempts to like shut down all of these foreign language sort of groups, because after 1917, after they become sort of more radicalized than perhaps the other parties as a whole.
Absolutely, because there's a problem in when you have an all-encompassing party, a problem that you might see. You have an all-encompassing party. There's the problem, you have to get everybody to sort of accept that sometimes you're going to win the vote, sometimes you're going to lose the vote, right? And that doesn't mean you should split.
Right.
And the problem was when the foreign language federations got too strong, some of the more European American, been here longer types said that, well, these guys, they just joined the Socialist Party in order to try to Bolshevize it, because that was their thing. There was tremendous influx into the Socialist Party by some of these foreign language federations. Other people were sort of suspicious of them, and this was, of course, played up in that sort of divide and conquer by the rulers. So yeah, the right wing of the Socialist Party did tremendous damage in that sense.
Was it a problem only around World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution, or was it a problem going back deeper into the history?
It goes back even to the craft unions versus industrial unionism. Right? Debs says somewhere that you take an honest worker and you elect him to a union office in a craft union. Pretty soon he'll start walking around talking about how he's superior to those layabouts that aren't in the union and are unskilled. That was a problem. It's a skilled versus unskilled too, because we focus rightfully so on the ethnicity of the different parts of the Socialist Party. It was partly the fact that the foreign workers were by and large in the unskilled parts of the labor movement. So there was part of that. There was a certain labor aristocracy arrogance.
So sorry, one more question.
Sure.
Kind of like in the narrative that I've come across about the 1930s, it's said usually it's the CIO that really integrates black and white workers into one union. And so I wonder kind of what happened with African American workers prior to the 1930s, because the way I understand 1919 usually is like basically the white working class in Chicago, like the Red Summer in Chicago. The big kind of quote-unquote race riot, was white workers versus black workers, and that that might be true. So I wonder kind of how the Socialist Party and maybe the IWW kind of tried to like integrate the working class in the United States prior to the CIO.
Well, the IWW was very principled on this in terms of accepting everybody, regardless of ethnic background or gender or any of those sort of things. The Socialist Party had right-wing elements that were racist. Victor Berger, for example, could be very racist. But Debs himself, for example, and I'd say the center and certainly the left of the party weren't necessarily, like, for example, in my selection here, I have one of his last speeches in the 20s after he gets out of jail, where he's giving the speech to introduce their candidate for, I think it's state assembly, a guy named A. Philip Randolph in Harlem, right? And he's making big thing about, black and white, they're just trying to do it. And also when people race baited in the Socialist Party, Debs was very strong, would condemn them, like the Elgin Socialist Party.
I heard that he refused to speak to segregated audiences.
Yes.
Yeah, that was one of the principles he upheld.
Right, which again doesn't sound like very much these days, perhaps.
But back
But in
then,
the context of the time, that was very, very big.
And so, like, someone like Judith Stein will write about how, our understanding, for example, of Jim Crow in the South, Jim Crow segregation in the South, that it's motivated primarily by racism. There's like a counter-narrative. I mean, the racist part, of course, is very true. However, it's also like Jim Crow is also becomes an attempt by kind of like Southern elites, kind of former plutocracy class, to like impose basically a cheap labor system in the South, and basically continues to this day. Like South Carolina has like 1% unionization, right? So how did the Socialist Party respond to them concretely in the South?
Well, for example, trying to form sharecropper unions, trying to form various unions that would unite black and white. And the problem was that was one thing to try to do in a northern city where you might have at least marginal civil liberties, but in the South it just left them open to massive repression. Because they were very active among sharecroppers at many times, trying to get them together, and other poor farmers and so on. But I mean, let's face it, we shouldn't have any illusions. America's not democratic. I mean, the southern states that used to form the Confederacy are positively, proto-fascist or something.
And but like in the 1912 movement, were they able to elect local candidates in the South, or was this? Because you said this was kind of like a national phenomenon in a way. It wasn't limited to.
They did have some people, but again, they don't survive the war.
Right.
I mean, in terms of like their political careers. They once had, I think it was Butte, Montana, they had the sheriff, which became very useful when the miners had a strike, because he deputized all the miners as deputies and kept out the strike breakers.
Nice.
oh, that's awesome.
So I mean, this is an example of what I mean about practical things one could do. But in the South, it was always very, very, very difficult.
I mean, there was the history of kind of, the fusionist sort of movement in the 1890s at least. That's kind of like when Jim Crow really becomes strong. It's in order to break fusionism, right? In order to break sort of the left wing of the Republican Party, or the Republican Party at large in the South, and sort of the kind of like upcountry working class base, right? So that gets like immediately repressed, or like how
Yeah, all these
does
things
that
get
survive?
repressed, and basically people who want to win office, right, always have to, I mean, they feel, and it's probably a practicality to it, that if they're going to survive politically, and of course politicians, that's their job, is to survive politically, they have to, accommodate themselves to their races. So it's interesting that Tom Watson, the populist who later became governor of Georgia, I believe it was, he, for example, originally hadn't been a race baiter at all. He actually rode to meetings early on, and very consciously escorted by like armed black and white guards from the populist movement. And by the time he accommodates himself to racism, he's one of the biggest race baiters there are. In fact, I'll give you a more recent, later 20th century example. In 1959, when Eisenhower sends troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, right, to forced integration and forced Brown v. Board of Education and so on, and the governor says all these horrible things and tries to resist it. It turns out that his father, the father of the governor, writes a scathing letter. And the reason being, the father had been a Socialist Party member, and his son had learned the politics from his father, but I mean, in terms of how to get elected, but not learn any of the morality or ideology. Sort of a classic father-son thing.
God.
How would you feel if you were a leader of the Socialist Party in Arkansas and your son winds up to be this racist governor?
Segregationist,
Yeah.
Man. So, jumping ahead to the more recent period, the period since the 60s, you talked about getting motivated to engage this history and sort of unearth this tradition by your own experience of the 60s radicalism. So, what does it look like to you in the last, generation of activism and of politics, where possibilities for rekindling this legacy might lie?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that can be done because there's so much that's not been done in recent years. I mean, even the most minor things, like having, for example, one of the things about 60s radicalism is there's a sense of humor that is sometimes lost, and also a certain sophistication was lost. So, for example, when I was in something called the Students for a Democratic Society, not to be confused with the Democratic Party, there was a speaker who came to campus, and he was supporting, I think it was George Wallace, some racist candidate. So the idea was we all got there with everybody, we get together and got there early and got the front seats, right? And what we had is we had a sort of clap leader, and every time he started clapping, we'd all start clapping. And we clapped at the most inappropriate time. And the speaker couldn't understand what was going on.
It's pretty subtle.
But people at first didn't get it, and since we were in the front, all sorts of other people didn't know what was going on, would just start clapping. And the speaker was getting really befuddled and confused and so on. And then about halfway through the speech, we got the signal, and we all stood up, and somebody blew this loud whistle and said, "This man is a racist, we have nothing to do with him, and if anybody here respects humanity," and I don't know, whatever else he said, "you're going to leave." And we all started walking out, practically pushing people, and the auditorium emptied, right? And the Wallace guy, according to all the newspaper reports, was just left sputtering. I mean, it wasn't like we just physically stopped people from coming or anything. But another time, a rally I wasn't at, it was some sort of right-wing rally, and so what they decided to do is bring marshmallows, and they started tossing marshmallows on the stage, right? And so a bunch of people were arrested for, a violent assault or something like that. Of course, it was thrown out, but it was here's this guy trying to speak, and people were throwing marshmallows. And again, it's made a mockery of them. And that sort of sense of humor, I think, sometimes, if you meet members of different sects, they're just so grim. Some people here probably know the Spartacist League, right? I don't think it's overly sectarian to say they can be, on occasion, a little bit grim. Yeah, ill-humored. Yeah.
Indeed. Well, what do you ascribe that to, though? In other words, if things have gotten grimmer, what have been the conditions for that? If there was more humor to it in the 60s, how do you account for that?
I think it's probably more optimism in the 60s. I think that's part of the problem is when you when you're reduced to just a small hard core, it's very hard for something not to become sort of like a church movement, or we're keeping the flame alive, and this whole idea that you have to have everything exactly right, or you're a renegade, and so on. Because when you have groups of 20 people and they split, and two groups of 10 and then they split, it really.
You also mentioned Norman Thomas, how he sort of didn't have a working class background. I wonder.
But he didn't make a working class appeal.
Yeah.
It's not the fact that he had a working class background.
How do you figure about this sort of in the 1960s, the New Left, and following? There's in the 1970s an attempt to go back to the working class, to go back to the factories and so forth. However, if we look at sort of the left today and its legacy from the 60s, do you think that's kind of part of the problem that starting with the 60s, we might not have had a working class appeal, or how do you factor this in?
Well, they didn't have a working class appeal, and they didn't think of it in class terms. They thought of it more in moral terms, and I think that was the problem. Everything became a moral issue, right? This is morally bad, right? And it's not the same as having class politics, I think. And in fact, I think they also have, from my point of view, a fundamental theoretical error. They assume the working class consists of steelworkers, of which there are hardly any left.
Right.
They don't consider the working class being teachers, nurses, service workers, and so on. They think it's like people at the point of production producing the material things. And I think that definition of class is an essential problem you have with a lot of these sects is that they only assume a tiny percentage of the population is really working class. Everybody else is either lumpen proletariat.
Or white male. That's kind of like the identification of working class means white male, right?
Right,
Like,
and that's
in the minds of a
ridiculous.
lot of people.
I mean, that's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, most of the working class in the United States, majority are female, majority are people of color.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, like, for example, if you go into many, many different industries, you find that overwhelmingly the case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Even the Chicago Teachers Union, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not all white men by any means.
Certainly. So I'd like to invite to open the discussion further. We've gotten a couple of questions, a couple of repeat questions from certain individuals in the audience, which is fine. But because I really wanted this to be more of an open discussion, and so other kinds of issues or questions.
And so you can speak more to the issue of labor then versus now, given that Debs came out of the AFL and had supported the IWW in 1905, only to recognize it as problematic. Like how, given that situation and given the state of the labor movement now, what do you see as sort of like, what do you see as common to that moment, or do you feel, or how do you feel about like what would be necessary in terms of a reorganization or revitalization of the labor movement? Whether it's like through the teacher strike recently or the Fight for 15.
I think the Fight to 15 is a perfect example of the sort of like labor struggles that take place in connection with unions perhaps, but like somewhat independent.
Mm-hmm.
And you see the same thing about people who have these boycotts against this or that organization like Burger King, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
boycotted. I don't go there anyhow, but Burger King being boycotted. So you also have people who are trying to organize, people who were previously unorganized. All of these things, I think, are part of it. So, for example, if maybe you could say unskilled clothing workers were a masked element of the proletariat back in Debs' time, I'd say fast food workers are a big element of the proletariat in our modern day society, right?
Mm-hmm.
So service workers, that those sort of people, they have the grievances, right? They're the ones that are most likely to, really feel the sharp end of American capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like one of the locuses in terms of, activity and organization.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
I have a question more about Debs' politics. I think you touched a bit on this before, but I think at the founding of the IWW, they emphasized that it should remain unaffiliated, a political party as an economic organization. Did Debs agree with this? Or?
No, he didn't. He thought the IWW should become essentially the labor arm of the socialist movement.
Mm.
And here again, the struggle in the IWW is between basically the socialists who supported it and the NR syndicalists in the organization. And that was obviously a problem because they had different sort of strategies,
Mm-hmm.
right? One was to avoid the trap of elections altogether,
Mm-hmm.
but Debs' response was, well, that's all well and good, but I've been there. If you just have a union, you don't have any friends in public office, it makes it all the easier for the capitalists to crush you. So, and you sort of saw that in a way about the IWW being crushed during World War I.
Mm-hmm.
So even Gompers got on board a campaign to get Debs pardoned.
Mm-hmm.
He was old and sick and so on, but still, and get other people pardoned. And the IWW just wouldn't sort of stoop to conquer and like appeal to people. So like Debs, for example, was pardoned by a Republican president, had to go to the White House to thank him. Or did, I don't know if he had to, but you understand.
Was invited to.
He was invited to, so he went. But the IWW didn't do that same thing. They were sort of a victim of their own strategy in a way. And so the IWW doesn't survive as an independent anarcho-syndicalist thing. And their equivalent in France, the CGT, also doesn't survive as an anarcho-syndicalist organization. It winds up being taken over by the French Communist Party.
Right. Yeah, that's like an old division between like socialists and anarchists, or really between Marxists and anarchists, because anarchists are socialists too. Going back to the First International, this whole question of social action versus political action.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, there's anarchist sectarianism too,
Right.
not just Marxist sectarianism.
Debs saw himself, or at least what I've read of Debs, he seemed to embrace his position as a international social democrat. What sort of relationship did the Socialist Party have to the Second International? And how did it differ from that of the Socialist Labor Party?
Well, the Socialist Labor Party, continued for a long time to actually have some real presence in the United States, and it tried to participate in the Socialist International, tried to use that to gain strength. He believed that, basically there'd be an international social democratic world sometime, or a movement, and so they participated in it. But given the logistics of the time, they weren't as close to the Socialist International in reality as they would be, say, in the 21st century, because it took so long to get to Europe, was where the conferences were always held, that was a problem. And you couldn't communicate in real time with the people back in the United States, to find out what was happening very easily. You had telegraph, of course, but so there was always sort of a little bit of a distance there, and they consider themselves part of it. But, it's partly an American thing, too. Like, well, good for them, and we're with them, but we're the Americans, we're the new country. So American patriotism obviously enters into it.
You said that was part of your attraction early on, to looking for homegrown socialism of some sort. What, in retrospect, how do you feel about that history? What do you see as problematic in
how the American Socialist Party became too American. Became too American. And by doing so, they made some tremendous errors. For example, actually believing that the First Amendment would protect them when they opposed a war. That's a very concrete but vital mistake they made.
About U.S. constitutionalism.
Absolutely. So for example, that was part of it.
Was part of that just Wilson too? I feel like it's part of the right wing of the Socialist Party saw Wilson and was like, this is the man we've been waiting for. So perhaps
some people, but even the left wing. Remember, John Reed supported Wilson's re-election, thinking he would at least keep the U.S. out of the war for a period of time.
In 1916.
So, there are a lot of illusions about Wilson, just like there are no doubt a lot of illusions about, say, Clinton in '92. He was going to give us health care, he was going to stand up for human rights in China. I forget what he was all going to do. He didn't say anything about interns.
God. So conversely, to follow up on that, so you mentioned, there's a little bit of American exceptionalism to the Socialist Party of America in terms of the U.S. being a kind of up-and-coming industrial country, etc. How did the Second International look at socialism in the United States at that time, before World War I? How did they regard
up to World War I? They were very excited by it, because they seemed to be following the European pattern in terms of growing stronger and stronger and stronger. And so they also thought that was a way that they wouldn't lose comrades who moved to the United States, and they could just transfer allegiance from whatever Socialist Party they're in Europe, and they could transfer allegiance to the Socialist Party of America, and the international movement would still be growing. Now, the split comes much more after World War I, with the whole split within the socialist movement.
And that split happens around the question of, should our national parties support our governments in the war effort, right? Kind of that patriotism. But the United States Socialist Party is one out of two member parties of the Second International. There aren't much more, but I know.
Three, maybe.
Italy and the United States, the Socialist Parties of the Second International actually resist the war effort as kind of like a programmatic national vote. The membership, we're not going to support it. Why do you think that happened?
Why the Socialist Party?
Yeah, why were they able to resist it? Resist the patriotism?
Oh, why were they able to stay? Oh, well, that's, again, very empirically easy to explain. A certain some of the native-born American Party members were isolationists. Those are the same people who weren't so concerned with the Socialist International. They were isolationists. A lot of the German Americans didn't want to kill Uncle Heinz, right? And another big component, Irish Americans didn't want to go fight for England.
Yep.
Remember, the Easter Rebellion happens during World War I.
Yep.
You have to remember, there are many, many Irish American radicals, James Connolly was in the United States, for example, who thought the worst thing you could do was help prop up the British Empire, right? And they were either neutral in the conflict. Some of them, quite frankly, wanted Germany to win. What would Connolly say? England's troubles is Ireland's opportunity, right? Now, other ethnic groups often had very similar sort of ideas, right? That I'm supposed to support a war to prop up the Tsar.
Certainly.
So, I mean, if you think of the different components in the United States, the people who would sort of be historically predisposed to support American intervention on the side of England and France would be English and French descendants, perhaps. Debs was partly French. But they weren't very large. They weren't a very big component in the population as a whole or in the Socialist Party. So there was certainly that. And they also, the Socialist Party, had a fair number of people who came from a religious pacifistic tradition. People who were lapsed Mennonites, people who were lapsed Quakers. And they opposed the war on principle, going back to the way they were taught by their parents about war is evil, war is sinful. Which wouldn't be the case in other countries, for example.
Did that particular constituency have a greater sort of power in the Socialist Party by World War II after the sort of splits that come after World War I? Is that why they maintained that sort of pacifist?
That was part of it. The whole pacifist thing was stronger by default because you lost all these other groups.
Yeah.
So that, again, but also when you turn with Norman Thomas towards making it more of a moral issue, that appeals more. I mean, it's sort of like fishing in politics. What kind of fish you catch depends on what sort of bait you put out there. So if you say, vote socialist, lower your taxes, vote socialist, and defend labor rights, you get a certain type of people. If you say, do unto others as you do unto you, and blah, 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 and you start quoting Christ or something, well, that's what you're going to get.
Maybe to follow up on that a little bit, because you mentioned A. Philip Randolph. And so rather than just the sort of Norman Thomas focus, there is a kind of Socialist Party continuity that goes up through the 20s and 30s and even after World War II.
Up to the March on Washington.
Right.
A. Philip Randolph was not the famous spokesperson for the rally, but in practice it was he and other people from the Brotherhood of Railway Porters who had been Socialist Party members, or in the case of Randolph still was.
And Rustin.
Yeah, Rustin. And
Rustin.
Those people made the march happen.
Yeah.
So that being the case, I mean, you talk about how the Socialist Party ended up in the sort of late Cold War era, supporting LBJ in '64, et cetera, et cetera. But how did they understand, through the New Deal era, through World War II, how did they understand their separate political existence, separate from the Democrats? Like, up to the point of kind of collapsing into the Democratic Party. If it's not, on the basis of kind of allegiance with Bolshevism necessarily, how did they sustain an independent politics through that period at all? I mean, I know it's not
because they basically counterposed themselves based on a higher principle and an anti-corruption principle to corrupt machine bosses in the Democratic Party and to the Klan-ridden Democratic Party of the South. Right? So they said this coalition in the Democratic Party is not ultimately tenable.
The New Deal coalition.
Yeah, the New Deal coalition is not tenable, right? And when it breaks up, we want to be there as a independent standing force to resurrect things. So, for example, when Upton Sinclair ran for governor of California as a Democrat, he had been a Socialist Party member. Norman Thomas
What
wrote,
year was this?
34, 36, something like that. And he was betrayed by the Democratic Party, naturally. But Norman Thomas wrote him a sort of famous open letter talking about, how horrible it was to join the Democratic Party. And by doing this, all you're doing is betraying our comrades in Europe, betraying our comrades around the world, but betraying your comrades here who need an independent socialist movement, right? To not be mixed up with either the corrupt you know, Northern bosses, or of course the
The
Klan.
Dixiecrats, yeah.
Dixiecrats.
Mm-hmm.
How did the Socialist Party respond to the CIO phenomenon? I brought it up earlier because the CIO, basically a lot of organizers are Communist Party members.
And Socialist Party members.
Okay,
Uh-huh.
that's interesting because sort of, I mean, I read a lot kind of about the 1930s historiography, not really about the 19-teens, unfortunately, but kind of the idea is the CIO builds a kind of first genuine mass base for the American working class movement. But that gets filtered immediately into the Democratic Party based on sort of decisions made in Moscow to actually endorse sort of FDR actually. So how did the Socialist Party actually respond to that phenomenon? How did
It just increases the bitterness they have against the Communist Party. Right? Because they're also involved in the CIO movement. Because remember, when you're looking for organizers, I mean, we're going to have people who have that sort of background, talent, and dedication. Well, okay, the Communist Party, I've got to give them credit, they did wonderful work. But so did the Socialist Party.
Uh-huh.
And so when the Communist Party then says, okay, all for FDR and all this other stuff, all for the Democratic Party, and we have to be moderate, and all this sort of stuff like the Popular Front supporting the war and all this stuff. Socialist Party, here again, they're betraying us, right? So there's really a lot of animosity between the Socialists and the Communists. You see this in union elections, right? Where the Socialists will have, a caucus or a block within a union, the Communists will have a block in the union that fight it, right? So for example, Walter Reuther was in the Socialist Party milieu, if not in the party, right? And he fought with the Communist Party in the United Auto Workers. Right. And it got to such ludicrous extremes that when the Reuther brothers were able to get a cost of living increase built into a contract, the Communist Party attacked them, saying that this is going to mean that workers' wages will never rise above whatever inflation is. When obviously the Reuther brothers in practice were right, that was a good thing to have in their contract.
This is in the 30s.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But afterwards, I mean, that animosity continued.
Mhm.
Absolutely continued.
Mhm.
So, for example, when the Communist Party used to control the local UAW local out in the west side of Chicago with Harvester, International Harvester, there was always conflict between them and the Socialist Party types. So you'd have like an international rep who was with the Socialist Party, and then you'd have a local union president who was in the Communist Party, and there'd be, I mean, they'd get along, they'd be practical, but I mean, there'd be a lot of conflict. Right, and sometimes one would seem on the left, sometimes the other would seem on the left, depending. But it was partly that old heritage.
Carried forward.
Yeah.
Because the AFL and the CIO don't fuse until later.
In the 50s, after World War II.
Yeah, and so that's a change too. That's not to be underestimated. And you mentioned Taft-Hartley. I know that's also a major change in terms
Or the
of
Taft-Hartley slave labor bill.
Exactly.
AFL-CIO called it. Right? Because what that does is outlaws secondary boycotts, outlaws secondary, flying pickets. It outlaws, it requires cooling off periods in essential industries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that gives the United States sort of the most repressive labor law of any of the major bourgeois democracies.
It's that establishes the National Labor Relations Board?
Right?
Right.
And which is a very easy thing to manipulate. So when Reagan came in, he couldn't abolish it, but sometimes they were, of course, ruling
They
the
get
wrong
to
way.
a point.
So basically, what he did is he defunded it, so they no longer had investigators. So if you're fired for an unfair, and you think it's unfair labor practice, the labor board wouldn't have anybody to really check it out. You'd have a pro forma hearing. I'm speaking from experience because I was fired from a job when I was working in a hospital, just to support myself. There was no political intention of this at all. And I was working in the hospital, and they came around, and they asked me to sign this pledge to cross picket lines in the event of a strike. And I said, well, what strike over what? I haven't heard anything about this. Apparently it was an old Teamster grievance or something. And so I refused to sign it. That was on Wednesday. On Friday, the same boss called me and gave me a 3% merit raise, right? Then the following Wednesday, I was asked to sign it, and I refused. And that Friday, they fired me. Seemed to me it was probably an unfair labor practice. So I decided just to screw with them and take the labor board. And the first thing this guy told me was, boy, they really screwed up in your case. This is ridiculous. They technically fired me for telling a joke at work. They said it was an off-color joke, right? But Anyhow, you should hear the jokes the other people told. Right?
No.
Something was ridiculous. It was something ridiculous. It was a dead baby joke, right? Everybody thought it was funny at the time, right? But in any case.
And sort of the kind of the narrative around the CIO, the 1930s moment, is whenever I talk to a lot of people who kind of try to delve into the history of the left in the United States, it's like the 1930s is the high moment of American radicalism. And the reason for that is sort of the CIO movement. However, that is a moment when kind of, at least the political party side to the American left is, much weaker than it was 20 years prior to that.
Right.
So I guess the question is, of course we want to look to a moment when the American labor movement was powerful. However, minus a political party, minus sort of a driving ideology, any labor movement can just get totally accommodationist to its national government,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
to its capitalist class. So what does a political party bring to the table that a pure sort of labor movement kind of like focus on kind of rebuilding an American left would not be able to?
Oh, a broader vision. I mean, unions almost inherently tend to have a very tunnel vision on their own problems, right? Whatever those problems be, no matter how legitimate their grievances are, but they don't have a broader social vision often. They really don't. And you see that with the CIO, right? The CIO, when push came to shove, was willing to let some of their most important unions be either outright destroyed or at least kicked out of the Federation because they had left-wing leadership. The United Electrical Workers, which had been a major union, United Rubber Workers, Mine Mill and Smelt Workers Union, on and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
They just allowed the government to use this red baiting thing, rather than having a fairly basic principle that, well, the unions should be able to run their own affairs, they should be able to elect their own people, right? They didn't have any broader vision. And that's been the problem with the unions all the way back.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's a structural problem with unions, because it's an organization that is focused on a certain set of problems and demands, and therefore it's kind of asking a lot for them to care about global warming or something, when what they're concerned about is like getting more vacation time or something, whatever it might be.
So you need something to, actually have a political vision.
Right.
Right.
And without a vision, the people are lost, as the old cliche goes.
Going back quickly to, we were talking about the Socialist Party's attempts to constitute an industrial unionism rather than craft unionism, and keeping in mind sort of a socialist definition of the working class as including the unemployed. Can you talk a little bit about to what extent there was an attempt to organize the unemployed in the industrial
They didn't do enough of it. The Socialist Party didn't do enough of trying to organize the unemployed. There tended to be a rift between the higher paid skilled workers and even the lower paid unskilled workers, let alone the unemployed. However, later on, radical socialists, and to their credit, the Communist Party, did organize unemployed leagues.
In the Great
and
Depression.
unions. In the Great Depression. Right, and did take direct action, like for example, when somebody being evicted, bring the stuff back in, defy evictions, various direct action like that. But the problem the radical socialists always had is there was a tendency that they would then fight with the more right wing, particularly I'm talking about now Norman Thomas, that sort of thing. And so a lot of the radical socialists would start out being radical socialists, and they'd either defect to some small little group that would be ineffectual, some sect, or they just join the Communist Party. Because the Communist Party was the one in the 30s, for example, that was doing this stuff. So, for example, the Socialist Party lost a huge percentage of their African American members in the South to the Communist Party, because the Communist Party was more militant on the question of equality.
In the 30s.
In the 30s.
Yeah, unemployment's obviously a different issue in the 30s than it had been before World War I.
Right. Because now you're talking about mass unemployment. How do you deal with it? And where they had administrative power, like Milwaukee or someplace like that, they dealt with it in a typical social democratic manner by providing welfare. So they used to say the difference between Milwaukee and Chicago is in Milwaukee, the socialists organized free food and free soup kitchens. In Chicago, it was Al Capone. who was the largest single provider of welfare during the Great Depression for a period of time.
Wow.
More than the churches.
Wow.
Because they were his constituents.
Of course.
Very appropriate to bring that up in a bar, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier kind of the way the Socialist Party responded to like the New Deal coalition and like this idea like, oh, they just like wait for the breakup of the New Deal coalition and then kind of I don't know, do something. So I was wondering if you could speak to like how socialists in America responded to the breakup of the New Deal coalition and like if there was any potential for them to do something or like why they weren't there to kind of take it out.
There wasn't much of them left when the New Deal, the coalition broke apart was the problem. And so many of them had themselves been sucked into the Democratic Party that they just became part of a wing of the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, the thing about Bernie Sanders is interesting is he's sort of the exception that proves the rule. Right? If this guy, now think about it a second, if this guy, without any party organization behind him, could get elected to the House of Representatives and then go on to get elected to the Senate, albeit in Vermont, but still. And now more recently, a small Trotskyist group has gotten a city council person in Seattle, right? This shows that if you had a broader movement, you could really do things, but there isn't any sort of broader movement. These are all sort of individual exceptions. So by the time the New Deal coalition breaks up, there's really not much left, right? I mean, I consider symbolically Norman Thomas' endorsement of Lyndon Johnson being the official surrender of the American, Socialist Party. Right?
Was it part of the way with LBJ phenomenon?
It was partly that. It was partly because they were still desperate to have some influence.
Mm-hmm.
They're desperate to have some influence, and they lost pretty much everything. Right. In Stokely Carmichael, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he'd been in the Socialist Party as a young man before he went on to civil rights fame and so on. But they kept losing everybody, and they were falling apart. And they thought civil rights, for example, that was part of the thing with LBJ, is by supporting LBJ, this would allow specifically allow them to regain a toehold in the African American community, which they had lost.
Is there an analogy, though, with Norman Thomas supporting LBJ against Goldwater as sort of a beat the right, as the ultimate strategy with what we're dealing with today with Trump?
Always. And that's
just a basic problem, I guess.
That's a basic problem, the way that the system is structured. Last I heard, the Communist Party is supporting Hillary.
Yes.
That gives you an idea how far things have come.
Because Sanders is not a viable.
He's an ultra-left.
Ultra-left.
Yeah, you got to fight the ultra-right. But as Malcolm X said, that's, when they want you to take the fox, they show you the wolf. Because let's face it, in any given election, you can always say, oh, this guy's going to be end of the world, and et cetera, and so on and so forth. And it happens on all over the political spectrum, because that's the same thing that the right wing does, is you get the most moderate center-right, because The Economist magazine, not exactly a radical rag, said, we Europeans find it hard to believe that Barack Obama, who's firmly in the European mind on the center-right in terms of policy, would be considered a socialist. So the point is, it doesn't matter how far right the Democrats move, the
they'll always
Republicans
be accused
of being a socialist. Meanwhile, the Democrats will go around claiming that whoever's nominated is a fascist, and that the camps are being cleaned up as we speak.
They're being prepared.
That's right.
And Hal Draper, I recently read this article about Hal Draper from 1968, 1967, saying, look,
Which article? Do you remember the title?
something
that's
with
okay.
lesser evil.
It's about the Democrats.
Okay.
Yeah, he's saying, look, that was the argument of the Social Democrats in Germany in 1932, when it was Bismarck, Hindenburg versus Hitler versus Thälmann. We should support Hindenburg because
He's the
not
lesser
Hitler.
evil.
He appoints Hitler chancellor,
Right.
And I think that's like a kind of like a right-wing focused strategy. How about if we support the more liberal wing of the right wing? Maybe this is going to get us something.
Right. You're absolutely right. And that's what we see with Clinton. I remember all these people were running around in 92 saying, I'm talking about the other Clinton.
Yeah.
In 92, people were running around and saying, oh my God, we got to stop Bush from getting reelected because he'll push through NAFTA and et cetera, et cetera. And then Clinton, of course, got elected and did exactly the same thing. But the other thing is, Bush, we know, was in bed with the Stalinist rulers of China, and he'll just send all our jobs to China if Bush gets reelected. You know how that turned out, right? Oh, he's going to give us health care. Oh, no, he did. He forgot. He had Hillary do it, and she forgot. I forgot.
So today, I mean, we were talking before we met, before we, actually convened, a little bit about, what do you make of the parties today? And because obviously they're not quite what they were in the earlier history. You talk about the 60s part of the way with LBJ, but is it different today?
They've gone through crisis before, but the two-party system is going through a crisis, in my opinion. I mean, you have the very real possibility the Republican Party will fall apart. Rubio recently said he's not sure he can support Trump. Right? Now, Rubio's not pretty right-wing by any standards, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and you've had other people openly say they won't support Trump. Lindsey Graham said a choice between Cruz and Trump is like choosing to be poisoned or being shot. So the Republican Party could well split. I mean, which is what I'm hoping will happen. But likewise, the Democratic Party, because you notice there are two completely different electorates between Sanders and Clinton, right? In other words, if you're white and upper middle class and over 65, you're probably for Clinton, right? And if you're under 30, you're for Sanders, right? So even this famous lock she had on the African American community, Latino community, is completely dissolving along generational lines, right? Yeah, if you're 65 and African American, you're for Clinton, but if you're under 30 and African American, you're probably for Sanders, right? And so there's potential there for a type of split. I mean, I don't think Sanders has the guts to actually split himself, where Trump would. He's just such an egotist. But Sanders supporters, right? I mean, I don't think they're necessarily all except Hillary, particularly if Sanders wins a significant number of the vote. At the
very least, it might dampen enthusiasm for Hillary.
Well, I don't think there is any enthusiasm for Hillary. I have students, for example, who are out working for Sanders this weekend, knocking on doors. They say if he doesn't get the nomination, they're voting for Trump.
Yeah.
These are Latino students.
Yeah.
Because they hate Hillary so much.
Yep.
Right? And they're Latinos, so they refer to Obama as the deporter-in-chief.
Absolutely.
And there's this idea that I've come across that if we, Sanders might potentially split the Democrats. And Sanders said, I'm not going to run as an independent because my fear is I'm going to get a right-wing Republican elected. But the idea is that it would, like a left independent movement would leave the Republican base unaffected. Whereas if we look at Ohio or Pennsylvania, those are always the swing states. Why? Well, there's a white working class base. So apparently the white working class base is actually kind of in flux between Republicans and Democrats. So do you think sort of the the conservative white working class that is motivated by racism certainly today is glued for that reason to the Republicans or
No, I think they're very much in play. And not only that, the other thing when you talk about who's going to win elections and what about third party, is they forget that the very people who vote for these third parties, left-wing party or something, are often people otherwise don't vote.
Right.
The biggest party in the United States is, I don't vote.
Exactly.
Particularly in local elections, because it's really shocking when you talk about some of these local elections, you might have 30% or 20% of the registered voters, but 10% of the potential voters win, and somebody wins with 50-some%, means they're actually getting elected with 6% of the potential voters. That's why, like, a left-wing party, if you started at the local level, would have a real chance because it could mobilize people. Just getting your people to vote would often be enough.
No, you mentioned, the local elections. So part of what generated the interest in our campaign for a Socialist Party was actually the phenomenon of the Chicago Socialist campaign for alderman last year. That went on in a more or less haphazard way in a few different wards. But nonetheless, it did seem like something was in the air. And certainly before Bernie declared, it looked like Hillary would be simply nominated, and that there was enough disaffection. I think that you also saw it with the Chuy Garcia campaign.
Oh yeah.
With respect to Rahm. And so, yeah, I just wanted to sort of point that out, that there was sort of bubbling up even before the presidential cycle and before the Bernie candidacy in a stronghold like Chicago, Democratic Party stronghold. There was still this, first really contested election, the Democratic election for mayor. And so the question is, again, where one might go sort of separately from electoral politics, but still keeping that in mind with respect to, because you mentioned, that this deeper history is, it's not only about running for president, but it's also not only about running for a local office either.
Right.
I think that's where, we look at this old history, the question of labor came up, we sort of look for, in a sense, even just social movement constituencies with respect. Personally, I have a sense that it's a kind of chicken or egg paradox. In other words, do you need a movement to have a politics, or do you need a politics to have a movement? What are your thoughts with respect to that?
Well, I think it is a problem like that. I think you need to do both, because the other problem you have with just electoral strategy is then you're waiting around for the next election always. Right? And I think that, once this election's over, a lot of people can say, okay, the election's over, we did good, we did badly, who cares, it's over. And you've got to have a vision of keeping things constantly moving, and that's where you get into the social movements and doing things. And also alternative politics. Get yourself a website. Try. I mean, because this campaigning for a Socialist Party shouldn't be just because you're going to run somebody in this or that election.
Right.
It should be that you're pushing forward these ideas and building some sort of movement in that sort of direction.
So the United States is fairly unique because we sort of come out of this revolutionary tradition. What do you think the Socialist Party's relationship is to these earlier American, what you could call revolutions, say the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, things of that nature?
Well, I think they come out of the sort of radical tradition, this sort of Thomas Paine, for example, from the American Revolution, and then of course the radical abolitionists in the Civil War. So I mean, they sort of see themselves as part of that tradition. Unfortunately, there are other not so favorable traditions that they have to compete with. But so they sort of saw themselves as sort of a lineage. And I think that's true of most sort of radical movements. They try to find some sort of hook, real or imagined, with ancient history. I mean, Wilhelm Liebknecht was the founder of the German Social Democratic Party. They used to point out that he was a direct lineage from Martin Luther. I mean,
Really?
Luther was his ancestor. Right? So not surprisingly, he did so well among Lutherans. Right? That's what I mean. Basically, the German Socialist Party was sort of the Lutheran Party in the ballot box. The Lutherans in the ballot box, right? Lutheran by birth and Marxist by conviction. And they used to say all the time. Well, so it was with the Socialist Party in a lot of ways. These were people whose interpretation of both the American Revolution and the Civil War was a radical interpretation. Right? So not surprisingly, you had people who sort of saw themselves as part of that. Right? And whether it's true or not doesn't really matter. I mean, that's how they saw themselves as coming out of that tradition. So Tom Paine was incredibly popular, for example, in the American Socialist Party as like an ancestor.
So do you see it problematic the way that the American left today sort of disdains this revolutionary American tradition? Is it something that a renewed socialist left would need to redeem? Do you think?
Well, I mean, the tradition's there. I don't know whether they need to redeem it. You should point it out. Like, for example, I think that there's many things you could take from radical Reconstruction and the American Revolution, and Debs, for a matter of fact. We're talking about somebody who hasn't been alive for almost a century now. To say that we're not trying to create something completely, new, we're following in the footsteps of other people who have done this, right? And we need to do this more than more. The problem, however, is there's a danger. You saw this happen to the Communist Party during the Browder period. You saw it happen out of the afterbirth of the 60s with the New American Movement that later joined to form DSA and so on, is that you get into this rah-rah American patriotism stuff, right?
Of course,
and constitutionalism and all that stuff. You know, you end your speeches with, but this is still the best country in the world. And that sort of stuff is also a danger. So you have to connect to it, but you have to be very clear that, you know, you're not connecting to Patrick Henry, the slave owner, you know, who said any government that's big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take away, he used the word slaves, I will take away your slaves.
No, I was going to say that just looking at American history, we've been talking about, you know, one of the anchors of our discussion, of course, was the Debs moment and the crisis around, you know, World War I, which is about 60 years after the Civil War. And then, of course, you know, a generation later, you have the 1960s moment. You have the crack-up of the New Deal coalition that does not translate into anything more left-wing, unfortunately. But there is, you know, this history of periodic crises of the two-party system in the United States, and it does seem like it hinges a great deal on whether anyone's prepared for it, whether any good can be made of it. You know, that in that respect, certainly the Civil War was a crisis of the American party system.
Right?
You know,
Absolutely.
which is usually forgotten. You know, it's usually not seen as, you know, this is a new party, the Republican Party, and they elect a president, and that's a major crisis, you know, that translates into a civil war, you know, unfortunately.
I've heard Joseph Schwartz of the Democratic Socialists of America say, look, there's a two-party system, there's a winner-take-all system in local elections that essentially makes it futile to build an independent left movement. Maybe I'm putting too many more words.
No, that's the old Harrington position. Pure and simple.
Right. So, so there's nothing valid to you in your mind to that position?
Well, no, there's some. It's not that there's no validity to it. Of course, that's sort of reality. But if what that condemns you to is either crawling into one of the two big parties or not participating in electoral politics at all. Right.
Right.
And, you know, winner take all, you know, things what we're stuck with, but you could obviously fight to change that, right, in certain regards, right?
And the parties can be replaced, because Britain has, you know, the constituency, you know, it's not a proportional representation system.
They have single pass the post.
But the Liberal Party was replaced by the Labor Party. You know, these changes do happen.
I mean, there's no Whig Party in the U.S. anymore.
Yeah, the Whig Party fell apart, the Republicans came in.
Right.
You know,
I think that, like, the Socialist Party, especially in its early history, was really successful in negotiating this in the way that it used fusion tickets. Like, it would, you know, work with the remnants of the Progressive Party or the Prohibition Party in order to find a constituency to it.
Like the LaFave campaign of 24. Well, the other thing is that's why the Democrats went after them so strongly, is because they saw that their base was basically in the cities, and they were eroding the machine base. They were a real threat to them electorally. But you don't have to lose. You're in danger to lose. Because the thing is, here's the thing: the Schwartz DSA strategy was tried in the Democratic Party for years, and even Stanley Aronowitz, who originally was a big proponent of that strategy, has come out and publicly said, "I was wrong. We've tried it. It didn't work." Right.
And it's fairly.
The big problem is that you know, it ends up being sort of the argument ends up saying, you know, sort of making this apotheosis of the proportional representation system, but historically that system was implemented in order to suppress the amount of support for the left in Europe.
The proportional system
Was essentially introduced throughout Europe as a way to maintain right support in the face of universal suffrage.
Well, that's the flip side of single-member districts. It means that a socialist candidate who comes in first with less than a majority of the vote would actually get the seat.
Yeah.
So the big thing, too, they used against the Socialist Party was so-called nonpartisan elections. Because people like Trump, they don't need a political party to advertise them. They've got the money to promote themselves. Whereas the Socialist Party, with the exception of Debs and some others, wasn't necessarily a party of personalities,
Right.
So it would just be some average person who would be running for alderman, and nobody would maybe know who they were, but you'd go in, they'd see socialists, and they'd vote
That
for the
would be
socialist
enough.
ticket.
Mm-hmm.
But once it's nonpartisan, I don't know if people have ever tried to like vote on judges, for example, in the general election. They'd have all these different
It's
names.
who you are.
It's just, yeah.
Yeah, it's name
popular.
recognition.
Name recognition.
Okay, any other questions? Or shall we? Wrap up.
See, this is when I start calling on people.
I'm tempted. The professor in me is tempted.
Yeah, you know how it is.
You haven't asked any questions yet.
Yeah, why are you so what did you think of all this? So, what did you think about this? What do you make of this? Make any sense at all? Or are you just thinking you wasted a Sunday afternoon?
The thing is, I'm from Germany,
Uh-huh.
and we're from Germany.
Uh-huh.
So everything is new to me. That's why
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
hard asking any concrete.
Mm-hmm.
My students pull that too. I'm new to this country.
Great. No, this was a good conversation, and hopefully part of an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Good questions from everybody. I thought it was really, really useful.
Thanks, Bill. Great.
And I passed around flyers. Don't forget to check out my new book on people's history of Europe.